Hi, I'm Dajana Yoakley. I'm a peaceful parenting coach and mom of three, and I'm delighted to give you the latest science-backed research on child development, parenting, and to support you in showing up as the parent that you want to be. Welcome. Hello, everybody. Welcome. Thanks for joining me today on the podcast. I'm really excited because I have a special guest with me today. I have here with me Emily Hamblin, the founder of Enlightening Motherhood. Welcome, Emily. So glad to have you here today.
Hello, thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited to chat with you.
Yes, I'm really excited to have you on the podcast because, um, a certain percent of my audience has kids with neurodiversity. So if you're a parent listening to this and you have a child that has, whether it's a diagnosed or undiagnosed neurodiversity, or maybe you have questions about how would I know? And we'll talk about this today, but Emily is your go-to person for this. Emily supports parents that are working on becoming more regulated, more a safe place for their kids, more patient and calm, while in the process raising neurodiverse children, whether the parent is neurodiverse themselves or not. And we'll kind of weave that into our conversation today, but so excited for this topic.
Yay,
So
okay. This is
yeah,
so
would you kick us
exciting.
off? It is. And would you kick us off with a little bit about how you came to do this work and kind of explaining to our audience the type of support that you provide in your niche for parents?
Yes. Okay, I love, love, love how you mentioned whether or not your child has a diagnosis. I just want to start there. Me as a mom, I came into parenting with years and years of teaching experience, and I was rocking it as a teacher. Like I was having fantastic evaluations, great connections with my children or my students, who I often called my
Uh-huh.
kids, and I was managing the classroom behaviors really well. And I thought, oh my goodness, all of this is just going to transfer straight into parenting. Parenting's going to be amazing. You're already laughing. You're already laughing because you know
Yeah.
like what every parent coach says. That's why we become parent coaches, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
It was so much harder than I ever thought it would be. And the hardest part of it, I mean, yes, there's like the laundry and the cooking and a lot of the tasks that multiply when you multiply the people that you're taking care of beyond just yourself. But what was the hardest for me was my kids' emotional dysregulation, which was leading to my own emotional dysregulation. And we ended up just with a mom who was so stressed, ready to just snap, who did snap often, and then had the mom guilt that was layering on snapping, and kids that couldn't handle disappointment, frustration, changes in routine, um, overcoming challenges, a lot of
Mhm.
different social situations. I had no idea, even with my teacher background, I had
Yeah.
no idea for years that my children were neurodivergent. I
Mm.
just knew that their emotions were really challenging for me. And so
Mhm.
I just want to start there. Any parent who feels like the traditional parenting advice doesn't really work, or I tried this thing that seems to work for most kids and it doesn't work for my kid, it doesn't really matter at this point if your child has a diagnosis. You can just consider their brain to be unique because actually all of us are neurodiverse. Like if we break down the
Yeah.
definitions, we're all neurodiverse. It just means that our brains are not identical. It's like a thumbprint.
Yeah. Right.
And then we go into, okay, then we have neurodivergent, which means we have neurotypical brains, which is probably, I don't know, 70% of the population. And then we have, I made that number up. I'm just guessing here. And we have about 30 who have a neurodivergent brain, which is just a little bit different. The wiring is a little bit different. And it's okay. It's okay that it's different for your child or for you. And also, it is challenging because so much of the advice is for neurotypical children and neurotypical
Mhm.
parents. So
Mhm.
if you feel like your kid's just not fitting into that, box of this should
Yeah.
work for my kid, this is the place for you. Like dive
Yeah.
into
Yeah.
learning neurodivergence lenses and approaches, and I think it will help a lot.
Yeah, yeah, I love that background and kind of the framework of where we're starting, whether you have a diagnosis or not. And just to kind of like give more clarity, if people do have a diagnosis, would you clarify what types of diagnoses you often see with the parents that you work with? Like, what type of
Mhm.
diagnoses do their kids have, so that people that are listening can kind of like opt themselves in, like if they do know what's going on with their kid, like this is for me or this is not for me, right?
Yeah, the most common one is ADHD. And most people think, oh, my kid doesn't have ADHD because they can pay attention. But ADHD is so much more than paying attention or not, or sitting still or not. ADHD has,
Mm-hmm.
a lot. We could spend a whole hour talking about that. But one aspect of ADHD is it is more challenging to regulate emotions when you have ADHD. Your child's prefrontal cortex, where they have emotional regulation, is probably about 30% less developed than a neurotypical peer. In other words, if your kid is maybe 10 and they're acting emotionally like a 7-year-old, that's actually normal if they have ADHD.
Mm-hmm.
So that is the most common one. And of course, there's other challenges because I have two, probably three kids with ADHD. I have ADHD myself, and trying to get them out the door for school in the morning, like, can you stop reading your book and put on your shoes? I feel myself becoming dysregulated because they're so focused on that book. They're really hyper focused, and I need to shift their attention. I'm feeling dysregulated. And then to get their attention, I might yell or snap, and then suddenly they're dysregulated. And then we have the screaming household in the morning. Right. So there are so many challenges. I don't want to minimize those. I also have two
Yeah.
children with autism on top of their ADHD. And so those are the main diagnoses we see. I also work with parents whose kids might have OCD. They may
Mm-hmm.
um, have some anxiety. No, I don't specifically treat clinical anxiety, but their child may have anxiety. And so
Mm-hmm.
those are a lot of the different
Yeah.
neurodivergencies, probably the most common ones that we see.
Yeah. And would you consider kids that are just more sensitive, like highly sensitive people, highly sensitive kids? Would you consider that? I mean, I'm guessing you probably end up supporting them, but what are your
Yes,
thoughts on that being a
for
neurodiversity or
sure.
not?
Yeah, one of our emotionally healthy families members has a child that I don't think has an official diagnosis. And the mom's like, oh, she's neurodivergent. She's highly sensitive. PDA is a really common one that's
Mm-hmm.
we're learning more about pathological demand avoidance. We love to call it persistent drive for autonomy. And
Yeah.
we have parents with sensory processing disorder, which again, I like to call
Yes.
sensory processing differences. And twice exceptional is another one where they don't always have a diagnosis for their kid, but their kid is extremely bright academically. They're
Yeah.
extremely talented in one area. And they can tell they're just really, they might say like quirky, and quirky in a way that's kind of challenging to parent because
Mm-hmm.
often with that emotional dysregulation being a big piece there.
Yeah, so giftedness, it can be a neurodiversity as well, right? So yeah, it kind of goes like along this, like you said, it's like a spectrum. And everyone obviously has like a unique genetic code, right? And the environment shapes our genetics. But doesn't necessarily make it easier to parent, right? So in the trenches of day to day of like the way that we live in modern society, with routines and schedules and societal pressure and our own like beliefs and values about what the day should look like raising kids, it can be hard when your child doesn't just smoothly cooperate and just go with the flow. So maybe we can dive into, what are some of the most common challenges that you hear from parents that are parenting neurodiverse kids? And yeah, maybe we can dive into some of that and how we support them.
Probably one of the most common ones is feeling so incredibly alone. Um, until you find your people, you feel like no one gets it. I remember speaking to a very dear, wonderful friend that I love before I understood my kids were neurodivergent, and even before I
Mm-hmm.
understood about emotional regulation and nervous systems and all of the wonderful things that you teach, right? Before I understood how to stay calm when my kid was melting down, why my kid was melting down, what to do about it, how to help them with those meltdowns. I just was really struggling. And I remember sitting with a kid saying, wow, you just asked your kids to make lunch for their siblings and they got up and made lunch for their siblings. How did you do that? And my friend turned to me and she's like, oh, since they were young, I've always included them in everything that I do. They've always been in the kitchen and I've always, tried to express a lot of love. And I just remember checking every box in my head, like, I did that too. I did that too. I
Mm-hmm.
did that too. And here I am and I have a different outcome. And I
Yeah.
remember
Yeah.
thinking, what's wrong? Is it something wrong with me? Or is it something wrong with my kids? Either one's not a good thought, right? And realizing nothing was wrong with me, nothing was wrong with my kids. We just needed a different approach. right?
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that's the biggest challenge is right when you're like in the thick of it and you haven't found your people yet. Like she doesn't get what it's like. Because if I had asked my kids, hey, can you go make lunch for your siblings right now? It would have either been they would have completely ignored me, or maybe not even heard me in the first place if they were hyper focused on something. Maybe they did hear me and they might say no, or maybe they would scream at me. Maybe they would have a meltdown because they felt like it was unfair. Maybe they would, there were a lot of different
Yeah.
outcomes, but it was very unlikely that they would just hop up and make lunch for their siblings. So
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah. And I think that, go ahead. Mm-hmm.
it was just a challenge feeling like no one gets it. And when you're at the store and your 4-year-old is laying on the ground and they're screaming and having a meltdown because you won't buy them the root beer that's on the shelf, and people are walking by and you just feel their eyes burning into you. You feel that judgment. Maybe they don't
Mm-hmm.
say anything, or maybe they'll say, oh, that kid needs a timeout. Or they might say, oh, my kid would have never done that. Or maybe they say nothing
Mm-hmm.
and you imagine those things in your head. Either way, you feel that weight of the judgment and it's heavy.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, and that judgment creates this sense of separation and like we don't belong, which is really the feeling of shame, right? So it sounds like the biggest struggle really is feeling shame and judgment and feeling separated from the group. And we know that we're designed for connection and social interactions with our human species. And so when we feel separate from the rest of the herd, we feel scared and alone, like you said, right? We feel that shame.
That's a beautiful way.
Yeah. Yeah, and so how do you support parents generally when they feel alone? I know that you have resources like a membership, which is a great practical way for people to tap into a community on a regular basis. But are there any other kind of mindset shifts, or you often hear like experts talk about like get rid of the shoulds, like change your expectations,
Mhm.
because the only reason, like, or not the only reason, but maybe one of the reasons you feel like you don't belong is because you're assessing yourself on their expectations. Whereas, like low demand parenting and kind of different like reframes like that. Do you find that helpful, or what's kind of your go-to
Yeah,
for
I
supporting
think
kids?
just listening to conversations like this is a great place to start, and realizing, oh, I'm not the only one that's experiencing this. And I think also it's important to recognize in our current social media age, I'm not going to go on my personal social media and post a picture of my child having a meltdown and screaming. I'm just not. That's not appropriate for my child, right? I'm going
Mm-hmm.
to protect their confidentiality for that.
Yeah.
And at the same time, it means the things that I'm posting are things I think my kids would be okay with me posting, which is when they're happy, when we're having a good time, when we're creating beautiful memories. And that's what I want to keep doing personally. At the same time, it's so easy for someone to go through my personal social media and say, oh, look, she has it all together. She doesn't understand. I'm the only one with this struggle. Instead of recognize that everybody does have struggles. The people in your immediate circle right now might not have the same struggles. We don't need to
Mm-hmm.
judge them and look at them and say, oh, you think you're perfect, but you have struggles. We don't need to do that as much as when we look at them and think, oh, they have it all perfect. We can remind ourselves everyone has struggles. I just don't know what
Mm-hmm.
theirs are. Right. So
Mm-hmm.
starting there, that self-compassion that you talk about, which is so important, and
Mm-hmm.
recognizing that even if our parenting tools right now with our kids aren't bringing the results we'd hoped for, that it's okay. It's okay to not know yet how to best parent your child. It's okay to not have all the answers yet. And the fact that you're trying is what really speaks volumes.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah, I love that, and kind of giving ourselves that compassion, like you said, and acceptance of where we are. The only way we can change things is to first accept where we are, and without judgment, without the shame, so that we can calm down our nervous system and then think more clearly.
Yes.
Yeah, and as we think about, you know, like you said, emotional regulation is one of the famous aspects of neurodiversity, right? Like, and maybe delayed emotional regulation, or maybe more need for co-regulation, even as they get older, just more scaffolding, more body doubling, right? Can we talk a little bit about this? Is, I think, one of the biggest challenges for parents is how do I support my neurodivergent kid when they're having these big emotional dysregulated moments, and I'm also getting dysregulated, because we know our kids' big emotions dysregulate us as well. So yeah.
The biggest thing you can do is to learn to regulate your own emotions, even when your kid is dysregulated. There is so much we can do to help your child learn emotional regulation, but it's going to take some time. And it is out of our control. It's under our influence, but out of our control. The biggest
Mm-hmm.
thing that's in your control is to learn to regulate your own emotions. And that's, I know so many parents roll their eyes when they hear self-care, but what if we thought of self-care instead as meeting our basic needs, of assessing what we need and how we can meet those needs so that our cup is so much more full for those times when we need to withdraw from it, when we have a 3-hour meltdown that doesn't seem to end. And there may even be some aggression in there, and we have to get physical to keep some kids safe and separate from each other. What have I done prior to that that can maybe keep my cup a little bit more full? And then what can I do in that moment to stay in control so I can keep thinking logically up here in our prefrontal cortex so that when that meltdown does come, right? And one of the things that really helps in that moment, like you were saying, is to recognize that our kids, especially our neurodivergent child, but really any child, kids that are melting down or screaming or they're defiant or they're dramatic or they're shutting off or crying, whatever it is that we're struggling with, they're behaving that way because that is their best attempt to meet their needs in that moment with their current set of skills.
Yeah.
And we could even say their current brain wiring. That's what they have in that moment. And they are actually doing their best. I don't think any child woke up in the morning and was like, do you know what would be awesome? This morning, if I go downstairs for breakfast and my mom gives me oatmeal with blueberries, but I really wanted waffles with blueberries, it would be so cool if I could take that bowl of oatmeal and throw it across the room and make a huge mess. I would love that. I'd love the look on my mom's face to see her look so sad or angry. That would be awesome. Like, no kid thinks that. My kids all wake up and think, oh, I wonder what's for breakfast. Or they think, oh, I wonder what today is going to bring. They're not trying to do those things. It's just in that moment, they can't handle the fact that they were expecting or wanting one thing and they got a different thing. Their brain gives these emergency signals that something's gone wrong and they end up losing control, right? So shifting it to that compassionate lens for our child also. Just like we don't try to scream at our kids or to feel that bitter, resentful feeling or to get snappy or sarcastic. We don't try to do any of that and we don't like it. And afterwards, we're like, oh, I said that thing to my kid I wish I hadn't said.
Yeah.
Our kid, likewise, they're not meaning to melt down. They don't like it. Many of them feel ashamed or horrible afterwards. And sometimes they may layer on even more aggression or screaming to try to hide that shame. But our kids aren't trying to behave in a way that's challenging. It's a challenge for them too. They need new skills.
Yeah. And so for parents listening that find themselves in that, maybe daily, maybe weekly meltdown mode where your kids just having a hard time, like on a consistent basis, can you tell us what it looks like when we co-regulate and use kind of this parenting approach? What does the future look like? What hope do parents have for kind of coming out of these weeds? Yeah. Is it always going to be like this? Or is this a degree and severity and the duration change? Where's there some wiggle
Well,
room?
I mean, if you learn emotional regulation where your child suddenly no longer melt down, like, no, let's be realistic here.
Yeah.
But if you learn to regulate your own emotions, you can handle their meltdowns, you're modeling calm, and then you're able to think clearly and figure out and remember new tools to use with your kids. For example, especially one of my kids with autism, he has a very unique sensory profile, meaning if we we have our 5 senses we learn in school, then we have 3 additional hidden senses: sense of movement, sense of oh goodness, the interoceptive sense, right? Where sense of internal sensations, and also our sense of like pressure and where our body is in space. So our body awareness, I guess we could call it. My kid has a very unique profile in terms of how much input gives him overstimulation, or if it's too little input, he becomes understimulated, and it's different for every single of his 8 senses. And so whenever I finally regulated my emotions enough that when he's melting down, I can stop and think, oh, are his sensory needs not being met? Is this one of
Mhm.
the possible reasons? And this
Mhm.
particular child becomes very dysregulated with temperature changes. If it's too hot or too cold, they're very likely to end up either becoming really annoying to a sibling or being one step away from a meltdown. So it would take very little for them to melt down. So now I'm able to recognize that and I see, oh, happened this morning. I'm in Arizona. It's been hot all year long until recently. And now suddenly it was 48 degrees this morning. So my kids are used to not wearing jackets. This child refused a jacket and we were outside walking the dog. And I saw, oh, this child's about to melt down. And I was able to, I didn't have a coat for them because they insisted they did not want a coat. But I was
Mhm.
able to recognize it, stay calm myself, and kind of gear everything until we got home so that we avoided that meltdown. Whereas me of 3 years ago, I probably wouldn't have even noticed because I would have been too busy feeling stressed about everything else going on. Does that make sense?
Mhm. Yeah, so in that example, what you're saying is like not only is the parent staying calmer, so they're feeling better about how they're showing up as a parent, but also they're able to use more of the parenting tools and strategies that they've learned to identify the unmet needs so that they can support their child. And then in turn, the child actually feels more supported and then has less meltdowns and less really there's less of a need for the child to disrupt the day because their needs are being met more responsively. Is that what you're saying?
Yes. And then, I mean, we could use the same example because sensory has been so huge, especially for our neurodivergent kids. The same example, I've taught this kid about their sensory processing. We have a little cheat sheet hung in the bathroom that I just taped across from the toilet. And they
Mm-hmm.
know what it means. They know about all of their eight senses. And this child can say to me, Mom, I'm feeling overstimulated. Can you help me find the headphones?
Mm-hmm.
And that is powerful. Like, how many adults me as a mom, I needed that. I was in my late 20s before I realized that I become overstimulated when my auditory sense is overwhelmed. And here's
Mm-hmm.
my young child that's able to clearly communicate that to me. And so that's one of our tools. We have a lot of tools, of
Mm-hmm.
course. And so,
Mm-hmm.
yeah, we have in the moment. And then, of course, out of the moment is even more powerful. Obviously, in the moment of that meltdown is not the time for me to teach them about their sensory preferences. It's out of that moment
Mm-hmm.
when we're calm. Hey, can I tell you about your brain? Right.
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
like you were saying, conflict management. I have these little cards. They're on my website for free at Emily Hamblin, Emily-Hamblin.com. They're
Uh-huh.
conflict resolution cards, and these are excellent for all kids and especially neurodivergent kids because it takes really challenging um, situations where we might feel like a deer in the headlights if they happens. Like this one says, your friend takes your crayons without asking.
Mm-hmm.
If kids have never practiced that,
Yeah.
they don't have the skills to handle it. Right. And so, as
Mm-hmm.
much as we can practice out of the moment and then give them chances in the moment, practice losing at a board game. If your kid throws fits about board games outside of that time, let's talk about it. I don't think that they're a sore loser. I really don't. I think that I don't know, it would depend on the kid, but maybe they thought that they were going to win. This was the case with one of my kids. They thought that they were going to win. And when they didn't win, they had such a huge prediction error in their brain that sent
Right.
emergency signals that they ended up melting down every single time they lost. And so what we worked on was practicing, understanding that even if you think you're going to win, you might not. And what can we do? Right?
Mm-hmm.
That was that one particular child. Sorry, I'm throwing so many examples at you here.
No, it's great. I think a lot of them are really relatable to parents, whether you have neurodiverse kids or not. Like it's very relatable to, have kids at different ages. And with neurodiversity, one of the big things is that there's a delay, right? So whether you have neurodiversity or not, like you could have like, a 7-year-old that maybe is emotionally more like a 4-year-old or, 5-year-old, or you could have a 3-year-old that is kind of the same as your 7-year-old that's neurodiverse, right? Like, so it doesn't really matter, right? Like, it doesn't really matter how old they are and what is happening. It's more about us adjusting to what's happening in front of us, right? Like, it is what
Yes.
it is. And so, what can I do now to support this child? And I love kind of using the child as like our guide. The child tells us our job is to respond to the child in front of us. yes, there's all these like assessments and like, you know, evaluations and developmental milestones, but ultimately it doesn't really matter, right? Because the kid in front of you is the kid that you're parenting, right?
Yeah. Yeah. That's so great. And there is just such a power, that moment. I remember the very first time I was able to stay calm during my kid's meltdown. Prior to then, I would say things like, "You're too smart to be screaming about
Mm,
the fact that there's onions in your food. Like, you can handle it at school. Why can't you handle it here?" Now there's explanations for all of that. And I think before you have explanations like, "Oh, he was masking at school. Oh, he had a prediction error. Oh, his interoceptive sense in his mouth is significantly more sensitive than mine, and he can't handle that texture." Right? I
mhm,
have all the explanation, not all, many more explanations now, but I think before you even get those, to just kind of trust and like have some faith that my kid is doing their best. And I don't quite understand why this is hard for them yet. And when we do understand why, I do think it actually makes it easier. And then we can really custom tailor tools to help them. But until we get to that point, to just kind of understand, I don't know why this is hard for them. I'm just going to trust that they're doing their best. And we're going to figure this out together. It is a
mhm.
huge, that's like the biggest shift that any parent with any kid with challenging behavior can make. And
Yeah.
it might be a kid never ends up with a diagnosis, but they have less wiring in their brain around their empathy center, right?
Mhm.
And that might be the case, in which case we don't say, "Oh, my kid's just going to be a maniac because he doesn't have empathy or she doesn't have empathy." We can say, "Oh, my kid needs help developing empathy." And
Mhm.
then we
Mhm.
find tools and resources to help us, first of all, model as much empathy as possible, be a lot more vocal and show it, right? Like if we're reading a book, talk about empathy. If we're experiencing it, just express it to our child, and then find a lot of tools to help them develop empathy, right? It's a huge shift
Mhm.
as opposed to
Mhm.
trying to
Mhm.
control them and make them have empathy. That just doesn't.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it makes me think of like going to the gym to work out to get stronger if you feel like you aren't strong enough to handle some tasks. It's like, let me go work out and build this skill or build this muscle, which really you are working out your brain. Every time you practice any kind of skill, you're working out those neural connections. And the more you work them out, the stronger they'll get. So versus like you said, like, come on, neurons, fire. Let's go. You better fire and connect with that other neuron because I'm waiting. I'm on the clock, right? Like you can't make these neural connections connect spontaneously on their own. You have to set up the environment for it to like for this interconnection integration to happen. So they need examples, like you said, they need to see somebody doing like see one, do one, teach one, right? Like they can't just think of it like, don't do that. Well, what am I supposed to do? Right. Like you know, kind of how we instruct kids half the time, like, stop doing that. Don't take your sister's things. Don't say it like that. Right. And so it's like, it's a lot of stops, like stop, stop, stop. But then the kid's confused because it's like, what am I supposed to be doing? Tell me what to do. Right. Like that is the skill building, like doing something else instead and practicing it. Like you said, that really builds that strength in that skill, I think.
Mhm. And then recognizing where our role is. If a child is consistently pestering and belittling and insulting a sibling, to
Yeah.
step back and think, "No, why is this going on?" And again, we may not have all the answers, but some of it might be, "Oh, they feel like their relationship with me is threatened because I've been so busy." This happened recently with me with my back injury that I've been working on. I've given my kids less attention. I've given them more TV because I've been in a slight survival mode myself. And the
Mhm.
sibling rivalry, when the TV is off, the sibling rivalry increased. And I went, "Oh, I get it. They're having less connection with me." So subconsciously, much of this the kid's not even aware of, but
Yeah.
subconsciously, they probably feel just a little threatened that something's wrong with their relationship with mom. And maybe if I push my sibling down, I'll rank up a little more and get more attention from mom.
Yeah.
And so the answer there is just to give more one-on-one time to my kids, which honestly is 3 to 5 minutes a day. I don't do. I have 4 kids, so we don't do an hour a day
Yeah.
per kid. So,
Yeah.
and that's helped a lot.
Yeah. Yeah, I love that. Looking for like what's kind of the need behind unmet need behind the behavior, and then trying to meet that need to the best of our ability. And then lots of compassion around all of this. Like you said, back injury, 4 kids, trying to survive. Like it can be hard. So you're doing the best that you can as a parent, um, and giving ourselves grace, lots of grace, just like we give our kids. I'd love for you to touch just a little bit on, in peaceful parenting, we always talk about like empathy, showing empathy to your child, verbally expressing empathy. And sometimes I find that kids with neurodiversity, they don't necessarily want to take it in at such like a intense rate, the empathy, or maybe even the communication. Like, I think a lot of times in peaceful parenting, we're kind of giving examples of when we're communicating with the child and what we kind of can expect for the child to say in return, but maybe a neurodiverse child wouldn't communicate in that way. Maybe you can talk a little bit about how they receive that empathy and the communication that goes with it, and how does that look different, and how would you know you're still on the right track, you're successful, even though it doesn't look exactly the same way that the experts describe. I don't know if that makes sense, but maybe you can clarify.
Yeah, in terms of modeling it, I think we can't model empathy enough to our kids. One of like a life-changing phrase for me is, I hear you, or I get it. Right. And then to just repeat back to them, Ross Green calls this reflective listening. Just repeat back to them as best as I can what they just said to me. Oh, I hear you. You think it's unfair that you can't stay up till midnight on video games when you have friends at school that can. Does that feel like really unfair, or does it just feel kind of awkward that they're talking about it and you don't get to talk about it on Monday? Like, how are you feeling there? Mm-hmm. Right. Oh, I get it. No one sat with you at lunch, and that really hurt. You were wanting someone to sit with you, and when you invited people over, no one came and sat with you. Oh, I know if that happened to me, I usually put it back on me. If that happened to me, I would feel really lonely and sad and hurt. Is that how you felt, or did you feel differently? And so I hear you and I get it. And then trying to reiterate and then relating it to me. So I'm not pointing at them so much as relating it back to me. That's been really powerful for us.
And do you sometimes find that when you offer empathy during big emotions, when they're having big emotions, that they reject it? Or maybe this is something that kind of happens in the beginning phases of parenting this way, where the child rejects your empathy and like, I don't want to talk about it, stop saying that.
Yeah,
or maybe they don't respond at all and they just turn away from you, especially maybe a child with autism, or a child that just, it's too much language, too much communication, too much intimacy.
Yeah, and this is where it depends on the child, of course. A lot of kids with ADHD or autism, especially with autism, they their brain processes language just a little bit differently. It takes a little bit more effort to understand or to communicate linguistically. And so if the kid is already having really big emotions and we're just throwing words at them, even if they're super sweet, empathetic, kind, loving words, sometimes it pushes them into cognitive overwhelm. Their brain can't handle all of that at once. And so that might not be the time for empathy. It depends on your kid. And this is where just noticing your kid, noticing what their body symptoms are telling you, their heart rate, their breathing, if their face is flushed or not, what their eyes are doing. And if they are getting more dysregulated as you're offering the empathy, chances are they're linguistically overwhelmed. They have just too much language input at that moment. And so that's where I offer empathy with body language, or with, I offer sensory, I try to get my eye level lower than theirs, put my palm. I actually learned the palm up from you when you were a guest in my summit. And I love that one so much. Putting my palm up, and if they're aggressive, then I stay a safe distance away from them so that they can't hurt me, because we don't let them hurt us, even though we know that they're doing their best. They don't want to hurt us, so I don't let them hurt me. And just kind of communicating with my body and my face, like facial expression is so important. Just like, right. But one of my kids really loves when I do like a pleading look, like, would you like a hug? One of my kids loves it, and he'll often be raging and then go, fine, and come over and get a hug.
Can't resist. I love that.
Few of my kids, that will push them further into a meltdown. They'll be like, stop
Mhm.
making that face. What are you doing? Get away from me. Right.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
so it really
So
depends.
much trial and error. So much trial and error for the parents to figure out like what works and what doesn't. Yeah. For
Yeah.
each
And
kid.
in that case, if they do say, don't make that face, get away, I would just say, okay, like back off. I know there's a lot of expert advice that says if your kid tells you to leave them, that you don't ever leave them during a meltdown. And I really disagree with that. I think respecting them, as long as they're safe and others are safe, right? That's really
Mhm.
important. As long as everybody's safe, that we respect, okay, you want to be alone in your room right now. I'm going to respect that. I'll be right here when you need me. And then checking in. Hey, do you need me? No, go away. All right. Hey, coming back 5 or 10 minutes later. Hey, would you like to chat? Okay, fine, you can come in, right? Like to just
Mhm.
let them have the lead there. But
Mhm.
yeah, in terms of, you can tell I have ADHD because I am jumping all over here, just thinking
No,
of the
I think it's great. I think it's
over
great.
the years. But yeah, if offering empathy in that moment doesn't help, you can offer it without words, with your face, with your intonation, with just what you're doing with your body, getting low, being open, being calm. That's another way to offer empathy. And I
Mhm.
find that with one of my kids, the empathy only helps when they're on the runway towards a meltdown. Like if they're
Mm.
ramping up, I might say, "Oh, it looks like you're having." Actually, they hate now when I say, "It looks like you're having a hard time." That worked for a really long time, but now it doesn't.
Uh-huh.
And so I might say,
Preteen. Are they
like,
becoming a preteen maybe? No, I'm just kidding.
my oldest is 13, so
Yeah, yeah. Could be
um,
that too.
yeah, we could talk about teens for another hour, but
Yeah.
uh, yeah, if
Yeah,
they're like
so kind of like
and I
figuring
say
out, yeah.
something like, "Oh, you really didn't want your sibling to take that book. You were going to read it first. Like you really wanted to read it, and they took it, and you wish they hadn't." Like that really helps on the runway, that empathy. But if
Mhm.
they're already dysregulated, it doesn't help very much unless they're back on the decline. If they're decelerating again, then it
Mhm.
can help.
Mhm. And what helps most when they're kind of like in the middle of the storm, just kind of like being close and present, just
Yeah,
quiet or
just
giving them
communicating
space?
safety.
Yeah, yeah,
Just communicating
yeah.
safety through body language, trying to, as much as possible, meet sensory needs and
Mhm.
um, keeping everybody safe and
Yeah.
minimal linguistic input too.
Yeah, yeah. And I think just being present nearby, right? Like versus, like you said, one of the biggest challenges for parents is feeling like I'm the only one. I feel so alone. And that must be so true for our kids when they're having a meltdown. I mean, I know we feel like that as parents when we're having our own meltdowns. Like at some point, it's like, I feel like something's wrong with me, right? So when kids are having these overwhelming emotions, can we signal just by being nearby? And like you said, even if they send us away, we come back. They're actually never alone. We're respecting their boundary of wanting us to leave, but we're going to come back. Like, you're not alone in this. I've got you. You belong. Because that shame, if they feel like they're alone, and then the evidence is that they are, in fact, alone because everybody has left and they're not coming on the door knocking, that shame really, I think, becomes another cycle of dysregulation and the inner critic, and it just keeps spiraling in dysregulation. It's hard to self-regulate when you feel like you're alone because
Yeah.
we all
And
need
this is where,
co-regulation.
if this is like a regular occurrence, which it is with most parents of neurodivergent kids, then
Yeah.
talking with your kid when they're calm and just
Mm-hmm.
asking them, hey, I know sometimes, it's really hard. I start with me again. I know sometimes it's really hard for me to be calm. Just last week, I was so sad about something and I was angry and I wanted to like do an angry cry in my room. And I didn't want anyone near me. So I asked dad to stay out of the room and I locked the door and I had some time to just angry cry to myself. And honestly, I felt a lot better afterwards. Sometimes, though, I do want dad there with me. I want him to hug me. I want him to rub my back. I want him to help me. I'm curious to know for you if you
Yeah.
have times when you're feeling really angry or sad or overwhelmed. And hopefully, we've done some pre work to know that they're not in trouble if they're angry, sad, or overwhelmed,
Yeah.
right? I'm curious to know with you, what would you like? Do you want me to stay with you or do you want me to give you a background? Do you want me to go away and check in with you?
Mm-hmm.
And then I'll like, that's a good starting point. And then giving them permission to change their mind, right? They
Mm.
might be in that meltdown and they said, I would really love if you give me a hug or a back rub. And so you're in that position and you're trying to give them a hug and they're saying, don't touch me, go away. And then we become dysregulated because, but you said you wanted a hug and I'm doing what you said. And just to understand
Yeah.
that it might be different in the moment, but it's a really good starting
Hmm.
point to just
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah. I love that. Such great insight and advice, because these are the most challenging moments, I think, for parents, when our kids are having a hard time and it puts us into a dysregulated state. And now it just feels so chaotic. And I think you've given us such practical and real life examples as well of how parents can get started on creating more calm and peace in their home, even if their kid has neurodiversity. So yeah, thank you so much for sharing with me today. Would you share a little bit about free resources that parents can access on your page and where people can find out more about you?
Yeah, the biggest free resource right now are the ones I mentioned, the conflict
Mm-hmm.
resolution cards. There's 50
Uh-huh.
prompts or little cards you can print out or use them digitally. And those are at my website, emily-hamblin.com. I also have a podcast that I love. It's currently
Mm-hmm.
titled Enlightening Motherhood. I might change the name in the future, but you can, if you just
Mm-hmm.
search Emily Hamblin under podcasts, I'm sure it will pop up with my podcast.
Yeah,
Those are the best
sounds
places to
amazing.
find me now.
Yeah, that sounds amazing. And we'll link it below the podcast as well. So I really appreciate you taking the time, and I know our audience does too. So thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you for having me.
You're welcome. Bye bye.